Greetings and welcome to 303 and a series of comments, lectures on the great set called the Harvard Classics. I'm Mr. McGee, and as you probably know, you can see my stuff on learnstrong.net. I'm very interested in introducing you to a collection of books called the Harvard Classics. Let's talk for just a few seconds about maybe why this is some texts you might be interested in. Originally they were called Dr. Eliot's 5-foot shelf, 51 volumes of classic works of world literature. They were compiled and edited by the Harvard University professor Charles W. Eliot, published in 1909. It's a volume of the original publishing. Considered to be part of a liberal education project with P.F. Collier and Son. They were published. Eliot worked for about a year after he gave a speech where he had said that a liberal education should, could easily be contained. He said initially a 3-foot shelf and then went to a 5-foot shelf of books. He worked with a prof out of Harvard named William A. Nielsen. Now, this project created, you've maybe seen this series sitting on shelves, used bookstores, back when we used to read books, a long time ago. This project in 1952 had a huge effect on Mortimer Adler, and he created the Great Books Project, which is a similar kind of project. Now, over the years, these kinds of projects have taken a lot of hits because, of course, the majority of the authors are what we sometimes refer to as dead white males and this kind of thing. A lot of debate has happened because of these kinds of series. But I'm going to suggest to my students that there's some real good reasons to still study these texts in a series like the Harvard Classics, and so I'm going to suggest 3 or 4 suggestions of maybe why we want to study these kinds of titles and how going forward we will do this project of learning about these titles. I'm a real believer, as you know, if you followed any of my lectures on Learn Strong and what we have to say here in 303 to you, that great texts are all about great ideas. And it might very well be the case that some of these ideas are ideas that we find abhorrent today, and yet they are important ideas that have had a tremendous influence on the way people think and live their lives. I believe that we need to understand our, what I like to call, intellectual antecedents. That is to say, the books that we will be studying and the ideas that we'll be sharing in many ways tell us who we once were, either as Americans or as humans on this planet, and maybe not so much who we once were, but maybe what we hoped that we could be. And of course, the obvious question is, are we still a people who care about these ideas, these great ideas? One of the arguments that I love to make, and I will continue to make in this series of comments for you, is this idea that you really legitimately can't argue or agree with ideas until you have actually studied and engaged those ideas. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, I'm aware of the students who, for example, will sometimes tell me about, for example, what Darwin had to say without ever having read Darwin, or, for example, in religious circles, for example, people who are thoroughly convinced the Bible or the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, or the other religious texts have certain things to say, and then when you ask them, well, have you actually read these titles, these texts, they will sheepishly kind of say, well, no, I let somebody else tell me about them. I'm going to make the argument that it makes sense to at least be exposed to great ideas that come in the form of these important books, these often read books. At least at one point in our world history, we read these books. We don't read them as much anymore, which is one of the reasons why I want to talk about them with you. However, it's very possible that you are a student who does not have time to actually sit down and read these texts in their entirety, or maybe you just have never even heard of these texts or care to even consider these texts. My hope is to at least pike your interest, maybe give you some reasons to think about picking up one of these volumes and reading them. The majority of the texts in the Harvard Classics, you don't have to actually possess the classics, the set, to be able to find online or elsewhere these titles. Okay, this won't be new to you because you've been studying with me in a lot of other lectures, but let's go ahead and outline nonetheless exactly how we will approach the study of each of these different titles. For each title, I will begin with some introductory comments. I'll maybe even try to speculate on why Eliot decided to include this title in the sets itself. And then very quickly we'll jump to a level 1, which, as you know, is just simply going to be a summary of the text, basically outlining what is said in the text, primary thoughts, ideas, and the like. Then I'll move to level 2A. We'll talk about major messages and themes. I like to pick up, as you know, when I teach a text, the ideas that move me, because maybe if they move me, they might move you. So I'll talk about the ideas that matter to me. Then at 2B, we'll talk about the rhetorical or literary techniques that are used. Not what the author says, but how the author says what the author says, and maybe why the choices were made. Finally, we'll finish at level 3, which you know for me and the work we do in 303 and the annotated process is the most important for us. At 3A, we'll begin to make relationships, ask about relevancy to other titles, other texts that we're familiar with, maybe try to make the study more realistic in our own time and place. And again, we're very inclusive in our use of the word text. We will use that word to mean not only what you read, but what you can see and even listen to, maybe even what you engage in your games that you play and the like. Finally, at 3B, we will ask what for me is the most important question. Is there any idea that we've met that you can relate to personally, that you can kind of own as your own or wish to contest? It doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. This, of course, for me is what I call learning, as you know, and the ability to connect new information to old information. So allow me to help you to enjoy some of these classic texts, as they are referred to in this set called Harvard Classics, and try to engage some of these ideas. Do they matter to you? Can they matter to you? Can they help speak to you in your own life and in your own way? We will begin here now in a few moments in our first lecture of the actual treatment of titles with volume number 1 of the Harvard Classics, where it will be a very interesting question, at least to me, to ask, okay, if you were going to put together a list of 51 volumes that would somehow comprise the great thinkers and the great texts, where would you begin? In 1952, when Mortimer Adler and Hutchinson decided to do the same kind of project, they began with the very earliest thinkers in the Western tradition, of course, the great Greek thinkers. And so they began, for example, with Homer and the Eliot and the Odyssey and these kinds of titles. It's fascinating to ask the question, what is contained in the first volume of a 51-volume set by Eliot and Nielsen, as they decided, and their decision, the very first title, The Autobiography of Ben Franklin. And we're going to have to ask, why do you think they began there, and then the journals of a virtually unknown thinker today, a chap named John Woolman, and then finally a writer named Penn, who, if you know of him at all, you know of him because you use the word Pennsylvania, right? But it might very well be the case that you know very little about his Fruits of Solitude, a text that will be included as the third in the first volume. We're going to ask, why start here? And what does this decision about beginning with Ben Franklin say about who we were once as a nation, as Americans, and who we are now? And can Franklin still speak? I believe that he can. I believe all the titles that we'll be addressing can speak to us at some level, at that third level of reading or annotation. So, I welcome you. For my students who are here at Worland High School, these are studies that can aid you in your studies, also potential plus points on test sheet. And for those of you who are joining me outside of 303, I welcome you, and I hope that we can enjoin some ideas, some texts that can move you. I know that they move me. So welcome back, and we'll begin with the autobiography of the great Ben Franklin. Thank you.